and it's a pleasure to be here at the Energy Institute. Neil and I, as he rightly said, we served in the IPCC. That given that I'm on camera, I have to kind of keep my diplomatic line. But we enjoyed that period and that interaction and the lessons we drew from each other, with the others. But here I'm really talking about this whole discussion around low carbon development, which has come up fairly recently in the African scene, but mainly focusing this, to energy. And this isn't. I'm not here to present any particular line of analysis, but rather, to tell a bit of a story in terms of what is actually happening on the ground, the kinds of thinkings that are taking shape in this particular area. And some of it is embedded in some of my experience while at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. So the outline I've got here is just to elucidate a little bit about economic trends, recent economic trends, insofar as Africa is concerned. What is the state of the energy system in across the continent? We know that we're talking about 54 countries, and so this is really a broad sweep of the common features that we see in the energy system across the region. There are outliers such as South Africa and also the North Africa, and then in the middle you have the sub-Saharan Africa, which have a much more of a common feature between them. And what are the low carbon opportunities, barriers, as well as the enabling conditions? And I thought perhaps zero in on the case of Ethiopia, which is one country that is grappling with this whole issue of aiming for a high growth, economic growth, but at the same time to do that in a low carbon, taking a low carbon pathway. To be more specific, zero carbon growth. That's the policy direction that Ethiopia has embarked on. But just before that, just a little bit of narrative around Africa, which is evolving. We need to just go back no more than 15 years when the economists wrote this one, the hopeless continent, and fast forward 10 years, then we're looking at a different type of narrative that's being written for Africa, that Africa is rising. And now, 3 years or 5 years later, we're looking at the possibility that somehow Africa is on a pathway towards something quite interesting. So for many of us who originate from the region, this is quite unprecedented, because Africa's post-colonial history has always been associated with something along those lines, nothing of this feature. And the fact that we're looking at a fairly sustained kind of good news is worth talking about. And here is what's actually taking shape within. Some of the fastest growing countries are in Africa, and you can see between 2001 and 2010 a whole range of 6 of the fastest growing countries are located there. And this trend seems to be on a continuing trend. And what are the factors for this growth? Well, first of all, there has been a decline in the share of labor force engaged in agriculture. So we're seeing more and more people entering into the manufacturing, largely in agro-industries, and also the service sector, which absorbs higher value labor, if you will. We're looking at also high commodity prices, which on the back of the Asian prosperity, and as suppliers of commodities, many African countries are benefiting from this. There has been a discovery of new minerals, and there are new countries that are entering into the group of oil and gas producers. This is countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, countries that have never imagined that they would be oil producers. And some of these features have attracted investors. So we are seeing foreign direct investments rising quite rapidly over the past few years. Again, and also, you know, in the past, you know, the story was always about, you know, brain drain, that Africa loses a lot of its well-trained people. But now, you know, what is happening is that even though these people may not be returning, what is beginning to happen is they are kind of contributing or perhaps investing back in their home countries. And there has been improved governance. Now, on the question of conflict, the jury is out in the sense that there are some areas that have benefited from the reduction of hostilities, but still, I think, you know, that is an area which requires a bit more attention. However, I would argue also that the quality of growth is something that we need to pay a little bit of attention to, at least because growth has not been inclusive across the board. And we are seeing what some regard as jobless growth across Africa, largely because a lot of the growth has been locked into the commodity sector. And access to energy and other basic infrastructures and services remains very low still. The demand for these resources to maintain, to sustain economic growth is rising quite rapidly. So I'll move quickly to the state of energy systems. And here we can describe particularly the sub-Saharan African energy system as one that has a dual character to it, coexisting side by side. This is, you know, the modern and traditional energy system. And also there is an urban-rural split in terms of the distribution of systems and practices. For example, here, just to give you an illustration, that production, a good proportion of it, is exported. That's in mainly oil and coal. And some of this enters into the system where, as you can see, solid biomass dominates that picture, followed by liquid fuels and power generation. And a bulk of that, you know, when we are looking at the end final energy, is dominated by the residential and commercial sector, followed by industry and very little in agriculture, which is quite staggering, given that 65% of the labor force is in agriculture. Now, when you compare this, what does this mean? What do these numbers mean? Roughly around 484 metric tons of oil equivalent. Well, that's roughly about just over 2 times that of the UK. The UK with 65 million population, Africa with in excess of 1 billion people. So you can see that immediately the energy itself is, consumption of energy is quite low, and we are really looking at a system that is at a fairly early stage in terms of the system itself. This shows the fuels used for cooking, just as a further illustration of it. And as you can see, quite a lot of that is, this is the green space here. A number of countries have relied quite heavily on firewood and biomass, with the exception of a few such as Mauritius, Angola, Botswana, and South Africa, which has quite a lot of coal used in cooking. Energy intensity has also been on the decrease, as you can see here, just as an example. So energy intensity has decreased. However, GDP per capita has gone up, as well as population. So whatever is achieved on this front, in terms of intensity, is more or less cancelled by the sheer weight or by the sheer size of the economy that is growing. This isn't very clear, but this is a correlation, showing a correlation between human development and per capita energy, electricity consumption. And here we really are talking about somewhere in the order of 600 million people, or about 70% of the African population doesn't have access to electricity. But what's interesting is, here what we're looking at is the per capita consumption against Human Development Index. And a lot of the countries in the sub-Saharan region are located in this particular area, which means that low Human Development Index and low per capita electricity. Now, there is no, we can argue about the correlation, but in terms of causality, that is something which is continually being discussed. Whether low energy services or low consumption of energy services actually contributes to a low Human Development Index is not yet fully bottomed out. But one thing is here we're looking at 4 different types of call them human communities. This is a German family. Its consumption of foodstuff over 2 weeks. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you're looking at an African community, the rural community, which and here that you can see the kind of inequality in terms of goods and services that are at people's disposal. Now the question is, no one is romanticizing about what's happening here, but rather how did you create conditions for people in these parts to be able to consume more, to be able to use to have better goods and services available to them. But the inequality issue is it also is regional. In the sense, for example, if we're looking at energy use, with a lot, as you can see, over a quarter of that is dominated by South Africa, which only has about 45% of the population, followed by also North Africa, again, that also has a small population. And the bulk of it, roughly about 80% of the population is in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see the distribution of energy energy production between these 3 different categories of countries. The same would apply for electricity use as well. I mean, here this is a kind of a Gini coefficient type diagram which shows the distribution of electricity use in different countries. And this red one here describes Kenya, where somewhere in the order of 90% electricity is consumed by 15% of the population. And in sub-Saharan Africa, a huge amount of the energy burden or the challenge is very much influenced by gender, in the sense that women absorb quite a lot of the hard work of fuel collection, but as well as preparation of it for food with significant health implications. So the energy access question, as we discuss it now, I mean, in the past, a lot of the discussion was very much locked in the basic human needs terrain. But now gradually that discussion has moved on to include productive uses in terms of how do you relate, how do you link energy and the productive sectors in such a way that energy can become a driver of productivity and vice versa. The other side of the argument, of course, is nowhere in all parts of the world where there has been a universal access or has been achieved. That hasn't happened at this level. The productive sector has to actually drive that process. I'm just going to turn very quickly to electricity, largely because there's so much policy attention devoted to this particular subsector. And Africa's power is expensive. you go to West Africa, for example, you're looking at among the most expensive electricity tariffs in the world. I mean, in Mali, Niger, Senegal, and the Gambia. Gambia, for instance, is around 40 US cents per kilowatt hours. And then, of course, there are exceptions to that, such as Ethiopia, the DRC, and Malawi, Zambia, and Ghana that have affordable, cheap electricity. And then the other characteristic as well is that transmission and distribution losses between sources of supply points is quite high. We're looking at utilities losing up to somewhere in the order of 25% of power produced. And so what happens also is, there is quite high level of self-generation among enterprises. And in some countries, for example, take Nigeria, you can argue that 100% of enterprises have a backup generation that they call on fairly regularly. It's not uncommon when you're on the phone to someone in Nigeria that they would like to get off the phone because the electricity has come, because there are things that they want to do with it. And for a country that is an oil-producing and gas-producing country, that's quite something. But Nigeria is not the only country. There are a whole host of other countries that also rely heavily on self-generation because the utility is not functioning in accordance to business, and it isn't business friendly. So I mean, electrification is critical in the sense that we've seen a number of countries historically having achieved universal access or access to 100% of their population. More recently, we've seen Brazil rapidly achieving that goal. South Africa has been doing that since, particularly since the fall of apartheid in the mid-90s, as well as India. The picture that we see in sub-Saharan Africa is so far is quite limited in this area. But there is a drive to achieve sustainable energy through the Sustainable Energy Initiative to achieve universal access by 2030. So you can imagine the amount of effort that is going to be required. Now, if you look at it in specifically on a per country basis, we've discussed that South Africa has already achieved roughly about 100% access, rather 70, 80% access. Ghana, which has done quite remarkably well, is around this 60% level. But you do have, those countries that haven't done quite as well, and therefore would have a significant way that before they reach that goal. Now, this is something. I know some of you work in Vietnam and Thailand and Burma, Myanmar. But this is something that fascinated me quite recently, that the story of Vietnam, that we've seen a tenfold expansion in power generation over this period in a matter of 30 years, which is quite unprecedented when you're thinking about it within a kind of an African perspective. But this is also, per capita electricity consumption itself has grown significantly. So this isn't just, a trend, that has been, maintained a kind of a consistent growth, but rather the size of electricity that is produced has actually increased as well, and achieving 97% access from where it was in 14% in 1990 is quite staggering. And there are some factors. Some of you know better than I do in terms of what the rationales are. One is, of course, sustained policy commitment by the government. The second area that one needs to take some good lessons from is the local level implementation. Here, the Vietnamese have managed to mobilize, their local resources, their local institutions to be able to enter into the area of energy generation and transmission, including renewable energy. And what I hear in the region, Vietnam does quite well in terms of the proportion that it produces renewable. But still, there are some challenges in environmental sustainability, reliability of power, as well as how do you achieve that remaining 3% access. So I'll quickly turn, Neil, how much I will go ahead?
Up to 10 minutes?
10 minutes, yeah. To low carbon opportunities. So, I mean, this is an argument, a statement that you will all hear about, you will all know, that Africa's emissions are quite small by comparison to other regions. And the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions happen to be in these two areas, deforestation and land use. Energy doesn't really feature. As I was saying earlier, almost 30% of the global oil and gas findings or discoveries were made over the past 5 years have been in sub-Saharan Africa. But the argument here is, do low carbon options, do they offer an opportunity? And given that we're looking at countries that are still at a very low base in terms of their economic and development, then there is room for expansion, clearly, in terms of the energy that's going to be required, generated and transmitted. And therefore, the argument of the low carbon thinking in this region is, can Africa achieve this by avoiding future emissions? Demand side areas, of course, within sectors, but across sectors as well, offer major opportunities. I will discuss this when I get to the Ethiopian section. I'll skip this very quickly. In terms of resources, the region, renewable resources, is well endowed in hydro, for instance, in Ethiopia, in Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as Guinea, where large-scale hydro potentials exist. At the moment, the region only uses something less than 10% of its potential. There are also, geothermal potentials, of course, down here by the Rift Valley. And a number of countries are looking at these options, including Ethiopia, Djibouti. Kenya has developed, a couple of plants. In fact, the Kenyan Olkaria has been there for quite some time. Solar is something which is widely distributed, but also, even wind in some of the coastal areas in southern Africa, as well as in northeast Africa. And as you can see here, this is just a East African Power Pool Master Plan, some of the data from there that I just pulled out. You take Sudan, which is expected to increase its installed capacity to over 15,000, as well as Ethiopia, and in some cases even, in the case of DRC, 100% of it will come from renewables. Here we're talking about also large hydroelectricity. So there is significant room to grow this sector. In terms of cost, given the reduction in cost that we've seen in recent years, I've done some calculation on, for example, here it's an interesting one where refurbished wind turbines from Germany was taken to the Gambia, and at the cost of a third of the price, because what seems to be happening is that the wind sites are being replaced in Europe in some of the plants. The medium-sized wind turbines are being replaced by large ones. So then some of these medium-sized ones, which still have a life of 15, 17, 18 years, are finding themselves in parts of the world where they are desperately needed. And here, you can see the cost of that is quite, it's a fraction of what would be if one purchased with you. The same with PV, plenty of potential. And the question is, well, I would argue here, this is the geothermal data, which shows you that this is the calculated tariff from geothermal, the transmission cost. The total cost would be 11 US cents per kilowatt hours. At the moment, this is what the Djiboutian tariff is, 30. And so we are looking at savings which are quite significant. And also at the moment, Djibouti is, to give you an example, is importing electricity from next door neighbor Ethiopia, and has managed, to stabilize its electricity needs. So there are, interesting potentials, interesting possibilities that are beginning to emerge. This is a project that we have running here at from UCL in collaboration with colleagues at Surrey and various partners in Africa. But I'm just, indicating this as an interesting model where agro-industries constitute something like 50% of GDP of most countries. So is there a room, is there a possibility to use these agro-industries for the purpose of rural energy services? And this is what we are trying to do, and building some of the business models around this. I mean, we are looking at a sector that is expanding quite dramatically. I mean, take the Kenya tea sector, 3 million people are employed, the sugar, 6 million, etc. And this goes right across Eastern and Southern Africa. And then beyond national borders, as I was saying earlier, the Djibouti-Ethiopia experience, but some have got even bigger ambitions. I mean, right now this is what the transmission lines across Africa look like. But there are ambitions, to look at these types of this type of growth. For example, here the Inga Dam, which is it's still in the pipeline for quite some time, but nonetheless, if that comes online, we are looking at a 25 gigawatt system that could actually make some serious changes, both to the Southern African pool as well as the Eastern African pool. So what are the enabling conditions? Well, as I indicated, there is an abundance of resources, and there is increasing hydrocarbons in some parts of Africa. A huge amount of international goodwill, as well as technology. The price of technology is beginning to come down. So there is a good story there. In terms of scarcity, these are the areas where a lot more work needs to happen, and a number of countries are initiating programs to skill, but also to generate internal capital with growth that countries are experiencing. How much room is there to be able to unlock domestic finance, for example, through entrepreneurial work, as well as, I think, but of course, conducive policies and institutions need to be in place to be able to capitalize on that. I'll just spend 5 minutes here on this case. This is the case of Ethiopia, which in 2010 came up with what it calls as the Growth and Transformation Plan. The idea of this is to grow the economy by 11 to 15%. And this isn't out of step with what they had achieved in a few years during that period, because Ethiopia had been growing, albeit from a low base, at 8 to 10% per annum over the previous 5 to 10 years. So this was an hugely ambitious plan. And along with this, a year later came another plan, which is, growing the economy by that amount, but also to do that, as I was saying earlier, without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So zero growth greenhouse gas emissions, mostly focused on agriculture, forestry, but also boosting the renewable energy production. The purpose of this is for Ethiopia to reach middle income status before 2025. And as you can see, there will be quite a lot of agricultural expansion, but also industry. Now, what does this mean? This would mean, in terms of business as usual, we would be looking at, here we're talking about 150 metric tons of CO2 equivalent for the whole country, but by 2030, if nothing is done, then that would increase to 400, most of it locked in forestry and agriculture. And so what the country is aiming to do is, instead of going there, but rather to be able to do that, it would mean a whole host of interventions. I mean, firstly, there would be changes in agricultural practices. There would be quite a significant afforestation program. There would be quite a lot of cross-sectoral planning, particularly on the back of energy, renewable energy. And this is the McKinsey chart that was part of this report. And as you can see, quite a lot of the easy pickings or are in areas of fuel efficiency and power exports and agricultural intensification. I mean, nothing significant in terms of new and major infrastructures, with the exception of this year, electric rail. And so what we are seeing is a huge development activity going on in wind. I mean, there are 3 or 4 major wind farms across Ethiopia, but also a very huge expansion in hydro, as well as geothermal. And also the transport sector is benefiting significantly because, infrastructure, the country is starting from a very low base in terms of infrastructure, so they are opening up new public transport systems, both within the city, but also connecting the hubs outside. Much of all of that powered by electricity, which 90% of it or 95% of it comes from renewables. So the argument here is that this is one way that Ethiopia can actually meet its own self-imposed target, if you will. And this is one of the more controversial projects. This is the Nile project, along the Blue Nile, where there is a huge plan to produce, to generate major infrastructure work on a 6,000 megawatt plant, which obviously means diverting part of the river, and with some challenges with neighboring countries. Although that seems to be sorted out or at least heading in the right direction over the past few days, weeks rather. So the argument here is, well, Africa and other low-income countries, could they try to do better in the pursuit of their development goals? Because that's something which is not something that one can compromise. I mean, I was based at University of Surrey before I went to UN Economic Commission for Africa. And just before I left, my old colleague Tim Jackson published his book, Prosperity Without Growth. And that book, I took a few of them with me and handed them out, to my new colleagues. And a lot of them were saying, well, okay, this is fantastic. This is a new way, a new vision that we are looking at. But this is an area which cannot, which is not up for negotiation. as far as they are concerned. Now, I mean, Tim's book does indicate also that the pursuit of development, pursuit of growth in some parts of the world is justified, according to him. But there are also other things that can be done. This is just a statement from one of the Chinese delegation leaders who, faced with 4 or 5 African heads of states, this is what he said: "Do not necessarily do what we did. Policies of sheer economic growth should be avoided. We now suffer pollution and unequal distribution of wealth and opportunities. You have a clean sheet of paper here. Try to write something beautiful." So I think I'll stop here. Yeah. I mean, this is for colleagues to read at their leisure.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I may have even more questions than I started with, because you've raised issues that I hadn't thought of. So I hope the audience has an equal number of questions. I'd like to open it out to the floor. Please, as we're a mixed audience, say who you are and where you're from, and try to phrase your remarks in the form of a short question. Could I have the first question? Otherwise, I'm going to wade into all of mine. Please, the gentleman here.
Goldsmith. My question is about the development. Should it go down the route of infrastructure you've indicated, or the self-generation, which is already happening? Which is the direction?
I mean, the thing about the self-generation is that, first of all, it costs you more. And if you're concerned about emissions, then you will be heading in the wrong direction on that front. And there's also a reason why the self-generation exists, especially in cities. It's simply because the utilities don't work. So I guess the question is, what can you do first of all to try and improve the performance of those utilities before heading in that direction. So I think any energy person, particularly located in the utilities, would argue that actually what needs to happen is proper investment in the utilities, upgrading the old equipments that are partly the cause of this problem. But maybe also the possibility to start afresh. For example, a lot of the reason why electricity, for instance, is expensive in West Africa, because countries are relying heavily on imported food. So there are a number of things that I think can happen before you march into the self-generation territory. Now, on the other hand, if you're talking about rural areas where you don't have, where the grid is not going to reach, at least in the foreseeable future, you have no choice but to go down that line. So it's a combination of technologies and a combination of centralized and decentralized that needs to happen, but in a serious way, because what tends to happen is that the distributed generation in rural areas doesn't really feature strongly, prominently in policy discussions as much as it should. But that's also where policies need to be upgraded and worked on.
Please, we'll go to the back and then we'll go to the front.
My name is Daniel Hidwan. I'm from Arup. It kind of leads on from your, nicely on from the answer you just said. What, in your opinion, does the role that micro and smart grids play in the future for rolling out energy services in Africa, particularly in rural Africa?
I mean, pretty significant, I would think. I mean, I'm not, the smart grids. I still haven't, gathered my head around how that would work in a rural community, particularly where demand is quite low. But this is you take a country like Mozambique, which has just a handful of power generation sites, hydro as well as gas and so forth. and a very long, transmission lines, which only go in one direction, and whatever is too far out on this side or the other doesn't stand a chance in getting electricity. So that's something that in countries like that, then I think microgeneration have a huge potential. The country that I was talking about, Ethiopia, it is investing a huge amount in transmission and distribution. But even then, their ambition is to achieve 70% reach by 2020, 2030. What happens to that, the rest of 25, 30%? So you still have room, you still have a reason, to still invest in microgeneration, I would say. But I think it does have what it means is that you need to build the type of institutions that allow you to do that. You need to put in place the policies, and also the business case in order to work towards that. The challenge, of course, is that those communities that we're talking about in rural areas are cash poor. So how do you then deliver? How do you then bring them on board I think it's a very difficult one. I know that in Latin America they've gone quite a distance, but even to close that last 10, 15% is always quite challenging, because those 10, 15% are they're quite poor. That 10% in Latin America, expand that by a lot more in the context of Africa. So the challenge is quite significant, I think.
Please.
Hello, nice presentation. I'm Pablo from UCL-Energy Institute. You presented a figure regarding that 30% of oil and gas discoveries have been in sub-Saharan Africa. What is your approach regarding, of course, these resources will attract investments, so it will bring growth, but how is the locking of these resources embedded in the development agendas of the countries? Or are they seeing this as like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? Do you think these resources present threats for the low emission economic growth paths like the one that Ethiopia is tracing? What are your comments on that?
Yeah, I think development first is the motto for many countries. The question though is, what can you use these resources for? Do you have the infrastructure to be able to use it? For instance, for heat and cooling. If you're talking about electricity, I think the technology that you're using is more or less the same. The only difference is that your generation will be different. So I know that there are some interesting examples of selling, trading the oil and gas, mainly oil, and be able and generate revenue that you can then reinvest in strengthening your energy system. So there is that model, which one or two countries in Latin America are pursuing. To what extent, that's something that African countries can pursue is for us to wait and see. But it has complicated. I can't deny that. It has complicated the low carbon narrative, in the sense that where countries are now saying, well, why should we? We're no contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, some countries are also looking at coal as a way to boost their energy generation. So I think it's quite a challenging discussion to have when you're talking about low carbon, which in itself negates the possibility of using your own hydrocarbon resources. Whether the hydrocarbons can be used for other purposes, that is as trading and then bringing other more sustainable type of technologies, that requires completely new mindset, totally new vision, and a very different approach, to what we understand. So it's a very, kind of nebulous response that I give you, but I'm grappling with it myself, because I do get those questions, when you talk to policymakers in Mozambique, what do you advise? And it's not an easy answer.
If we go to the back, well, I can see three hands, so we'll do the lady at the back, and then we'll go to the other with the gentleman. Please, you first.
Hi, Alice UPC, I'm a climate economist at the Centre for Global Development. My question is about deforestation and land use. On your marginal abatement cost curve graph, of course, a lot of the low-hanging fruit are in fuel efficiency, but as you showed, a huge bunch of emissions reduction potential is to reduce deforestation, massive afforestation programs. My question was, are you optimistic about this? Because of course it requires political will, enabling institutions and so on.
Yeah, and absolutely. It does require quite a lot of that. It requires, they seem to be working towards their target. I'm talking specifically about Ethiopia, but afforestation programs are not easy to maintain as well. They do require a huge amount of labor, a huge amount of institutional muscle to be able to implement those. So I think it is quite challenging. One other model they're looking at is agroforestry type of initiatives. It is embedded, within your agricultural system, and there is some room to be able to negotiate, those directions that you take. To what extent, can you use, because countries like Ethiopia are pursuing what you would call developmental state, where the state has a very strong kind of, is the strong driver. To what extent, you can actually filter some of that towards strengthening local communities to take ownership of their resources and be able to trade that as well, through, you're thinking of carbon markets, for example. So I think the opportunities are there, but as you said, afforestation initiatives are not easy to manage and push forward. The country has in the past embarked on a massive, afforestation program. Some successfully, some not. So I think, there's still room, but at the same time, you have to almost, wish that this experiment works. So it's I was talking to a colleague, sometimes, when you're talking about those issues, you can't help but think, well, we need some working models, and the hope is that, this may be one of them. At least, it works, to a certain point.
Hi, my name's Becky Morgan. I'm from Imperial College London. I was just wondering if you were aware of any novel or unusual approaches to getting private sector investment in large-scale generation, because obviously a lot of these countries don't have the state funds to pay for it themselves. Donors often ask for liberalisation, which doesn't necessarily work out, and even if it is done with some degree of success, it's still a really tricky investment environment for private companies.
Are you thinking of what, local private sector or external private sector?
It could be either. I've looked at both a little bit, but not as much as I'd like to.
Yeah. Well, a lot of countries are putting in, regulations and legislation to draw private sector investment. In fact, right across the board, you have all kinds of things like feed-in tariff, for instance, around 20 or 30 African countries are implementing those. A large part of it is to try and grow in and to boost the kind of attractiveness to the private sector. You have certain donors, for example, USA is investing a huge amount in enterprise, for example, in energy. So there is a significant driving towards that. But I suppose, the challenge is how do we have any examples where the private sector was the driving force towards full-scale electrification programs? Every other electrification program, successful programs that we've seen historically, have not happened, through the private sector's back. I'm not saying it isn't, but again, that's a new terrain. That's a new territory. And this is something which, when we talk with colleagues, who are investing a lot of time and a lot of effort in strengthening the private sectors, to make it feasible for the private sector to operate. You ask the question, well, next door country is also doing the same thing. The other country is doing the same. Everyone is doing the same thing. What makes you think that the private sector will come here? What are you offering that is completely new that Kenya is offering? Is not offering. So it's a pretty tough territory because every country is hoping to entice the private sector. Of course, the other argument is also that the private sector's returns, the expected returns, are going to have to be quite high. No private sector player will come in and invest if the returns are not good. 30-40% returns is what we'll be looking at. So some countries, such as Ethiopia, for instance, have chosen a different path. They've taken the path of taking loans from China, from the African Development Bank, that offers loans at concessionary rates at 1 to 2%, and really taking the risk for the state, to take the risk. And they have been fairly successful. They are beginning to implement, real projects on the ground. Whereas I think the private sector, waiting for the private sector, is something that's actually happening quite a lot. Whether that will materialize at the end of it, I hope it does, but I'm not entirely sure.
So I'm really glad you mentioned, Sasha Mehta from Mehta Consulting. I'm really glad you mentioned Tim Jackson's book. It's actually first, and I got a lot of these energy discussions and seminars. It's the first time I've heard anybody mention it since he published his book, which I think is a tragedy. So my question is very closely related to that. It's touched on a point that somebody brought up earlier of centralized versus decentralized energy systems and the coupling that has with economic development, what types of modes and modalities of production we enter into as a result. And I think, particularly in terms of Tim Jackson's book and the idea of enriching communities and of doing things in a more local and prosperous way rather than growth. So not necessarily more consumption, but more value generated from human quality of life perspective. So I think energy has a key role in this, and I think that Africa has some key resources that nobody else has in terms of social capital, natural capital that have not been degraded to the degree that they have been in the developed countries, which actually places them in a very positive position to take advantage of a much more distributed energy system. Of course, from the foreign direct investment and capital inflows, people would prefer to invest in large power plants and in simple projects because it's much easier to get financing of $100 to $500 million than it is to get $10 million, generally speaking. What is, in your view, sort of the barriers to achieving that? I mean, I've mentioned some of them, but I think you have a lot more of a contextual grasp on it. What are some of the real challenges to enable this distributed energy provision? Because that is a true pathway for Africa to potentially leapfrog in some areas and to accelerate their growth, but not in the way that it's been done in the West.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Maybe we should work on a paper on that. But
I would love to.
I mean, it's a really good question. And my sense is that two things. Number one, the policy players themselves may not be looking at, because if you look at, countries' policies at the moment, particularly energy policy, these are geared, towards precisely those ones, that we're talking about, the high level, the big projects. So there is a kind of a lock-in in terms of, the policy mentality, towards those types of projects, because the thinking is that, these are the ones that will deliver transformation. Those are the ones that deliver. To some extent, it is true, but that leaves, a lot of potentials undeveloped. The ones that you're talking about, the small scale. The challenge, with the distributed route, and I think part of it is to do with poverty, let's say. Because when you're talking about distributed generation, you really are looking at rural communities that are not cash rich. So in essence, you have to, how do you then energize the private sector to enter into those types of territories where they're not going to get the returns that they wish to get? So I think that those are the two difficulties that I see. But of course, I mean, you could explore other types of distributed generation in peri-urban, urban areas, and so forth. And I think that discussion, we haven't had that discussion yet. Because we've been sort of locked into this high level,
Big bang.
big investment type of thinking. And the challenge of that is how do you break away from it? I think that's a real, which is why I think there is some space there to do some work to demonstrate the value of precisely those kinds of scales.
So we have time for a last round of quick questions. I'm going to only take 3. So I saw Bernard, maybe this gentleman here, and we'll finish with Paul. And I'll have to apologize to everyone else. So Bernard, please.
My name is Bernard. I'm from the Energy Institute. I just want you to comment on the 2 aspirations of afforestation and increasing access to electricity. Because much of the time when you talk about access to electricity, we are talking about lighting service.
Yeah.
But the major consumption comes from the forest. That's cooking service.
Yeah.
So just how, when we talk about having a healthy forest and having increasing access to electricity, just how do these 2 fit?
Yeah, I mean, are you talking about lighting or electricity? Which one are you talking about? If you're talking about lighting, then...
When we talk about access to electricity, we basically talk about lighting. We don't talk about cooking with electricity.
So you're talking about at household level?
Yes, and the household level combination is what actually affects the forests, because people harvest trees from the forest to be able to cook, and that will continue happening as long as people are alive.
I think that's to me, especially if you're talking about rural areas, the question of access becomes more about the question of the issue of access to cooking services. That's very fundamental. Because right now, you're talking about in the Sahel or in Ethiopia, for instance, you're looking at people, women having to travel, to spend 4 hours daily to collect firewood. So if you're working towards making your cooking more efficient, then the argument there is that it would reduce those burdens imposed on households. How true that is, I don't know, because the moment you have a bit more, you may end up having to consume a little bit more. So in a sense, that may end up being the same issue. But for me, I think the real challenge in terms of the burden to the household is not so much lighting. It is the fuel wood crisis is something which is quite serious. And in some parts of the world, in some parts of Africa, there is no fuel wood whatsoever. And so then people having to travel further, to spend more. The amount even urban areas are spending on charcoal and fuel wood is quite significant. So unless you solve that, the lighting issue becomes quite redundant, because the lighting is not the energy problem for poor people. In fact, there is a saying that giving lighting to people only sheds light on poverty. I mean, I'm not saying that I subscribe to that, but nonetheless, there are those who argue that.
Yes, thank you for the report. Adon Laker from Minas Associates, thank you for the presentation. Just one question regarding different projects in Africa, right? I mean, a lot of African countries got different resources in order to generate power and so on. In the north, you definitely have a huge potential for solar power. We got Nigeria, where they're actually looking into a huge project when it comes to power generation using gas. And then you got the Congo, obviously, the Inga Dam. The projects are to go to upgrade Inga 1, 2, and maybe 3. And Kenya, obviously, they are looking in ways of creating this huge pipeline between Tanzania that would use gas as well. So what we're seeing is that different countries within those regions are really trying to come up with a strategy that could benefit different regions. And my question is, which region at the moment do you think that have a pretty sustainable vision in order to achieve that? Because we're having different strategies taking place at the same time. So is there a strategy that you think, okay, that's something that a lot of countries should follow?
I personally think, the southern African region and the eastern African region are the two to consider. I mean, North Africa, you can leave it aside because it really doesn't feature in terms of, the energy challenges. Because I think, they have more or less, managed to address some of the fundamental energy problems in North Africa. But the East and the South are, and they're doing it very differently. For example, the Southern African region is to some extent, fairly well integrated, largely because, South Africa is a big market. And it creates the type of, creates investment because it is a big market. We've heard, recently that South Africa itself is having difficulties in supplying its own power and so forth. It's having shortfalls. So a lot of the kind of investments, are taking place in Mozambique, in Zambia, and various others. So there's an interesting development there that has been going on for quite some time. The other one, I think, the East African one, provided that the political will is there, could be an interesting one as well. Already, you're seeing bilateral relations between, as I was saying, Ethiopia and Djibouti, Ethiopia and Sudan, Ethiopia and Kenya. Transmission lines are actually, connected. Ethiopia and Sudan, north and south as well. So, and there's also this massive, big kind of ambition to take that further, to connect, the two East and Southern African power pools as well. There's that, IRENA, for instance, the International Renewable Energy Agency, is coming up with these ideas of the African Clean Energy Corridor, for instance. So that area is doing quite well, or moving, or at least, it's demonstrating some interesting results. West Africa is still quite challenging, although the potential in West Africa can be quite significant. Because you got some big countries like Nigeria. We see what happens in Nigeria now, given that there is a political change. You have Ghana, which has always operated a very healthy, relatively speaking, electricity or power sector. So there are the possibilities in West Africa as well, but a lot is going on, in a very isolated kind of ways. There isn't, the same degree of integration that you see in Southern Africa, potential in East Africa as well.
So do you think that this region needs, let's say, some kind of hegemonic country that would project this vision that this is basically what's going to happen? Because the South African example, obviously they're trying to integrate different regions, but it's really to supply the South African demand that's there. And it's not necessarily going to help, let's say, the DRC or even Angola. Definitely you got Zambia and Namibia who are also benefiting from this project, the Inga project that's definitely I think it's gonna take place. But do you think that these regions need a hegemonic actor that would project this vision for the whole region?
Wow, that's interesting question. Who would that be, the hegemonic actor? I mean, that's the challenge. I think the message I take from this is that in South Africa, although it serves as a potential user, as a potential consumer, as a potential market creator, it doesn't mean that all of it will go to South Africa. There will be investments that, because the other parts are also beginning to move. I mean Mozambique is and Angola are fast-growing countries as well, where industries and agro-industries and so forth are developing. So countries are not going to just hand over their energy. They're also creating value within their economy to be able to take their share. The advantage you have is that South Africa is there to become the fulcrum in terms of these types of investments. But also, don't forget, investors from South Africa as well are potentially are there. ESCOM is a big player in terms of in that. I don't know. Did you say that Inga will happen?
Because the thing is,
Actually, we're running a little short of time, so I'm going to give Paul the last question.
Thank you, Neil. I'm Paul Eakins from UCL Institute of Sustainable Resources. You've said several times this low carbon stuff in Africa is quite a challenging agenda. Seems to me to be positively heroic. And this kind of development first idea, which leads in the mindset straight to large-scale fossil fuel plants from a centralized grid to lots of CO2 emissions. I mean, that's kind of what people always think. That's your business as usual that you referred to. There are really two ways that I can see of breaking that mindset, and I'd like you to comment on them. One is that low carbon becomes really much cheaper than fossil fuels. For the big dams, in some parts, that's already the case. And you kind of hinted that you thought it might be the case elsewhere because fossil fuel generation is so expensive in many parts. But it clearly is not yet perceived to be cheaper. So what's the trajectory there that you think might happen? And the other issue, which hasn't really come up yet, you will know that all the climate models suggest that Africa is going to be hit very hard indeed by climate change. So it's interesting that the political rhetoric is still development first, imagining that development will last if there is climate change. But clearly it won't. The kind of factual is not a high growth, high welfare, high carbon scenario going out in the future. That's not on the table, unfortunately. We'd all quite like it if it was. But to what extent do African politicians get that? Or do they just reckon still that that's someone else's problem and that they've got to concentrate on the development side?
Let me take the second question first. I think for African politicians, what is going on is that they see the development first thinking. I'm not saying that politicians subscribe to this, but let's assume. They see that as one way that you can actually build resilience in your system. You've spoken about, for instance, climate change, will hit Africa hard and so forth. Yes. One of the things, for example, is how do you create conditions, that are conducive for small farmers to flourish, to survive, to exist. At the moment, you're relying on grain-fed agriculture. An African policymaker would think, well, these negotiations may not give me very much room, very much hope. But at the very least, what I can do is create the infrastructure that would allow people to be able to store water and be able to farm and improve their livelihoods. So in a sense, the thinking about development first is not just development for its own sake, but rather development for adaptation, for survival. So I think that's probably where the thinking lies. Now, I think there are a number of politicians that are really looking at the low carbon potentials because number one, they see that perhaps that the future is low carbon for the reasons that you described before. But also they may see that there is economic value. Right? I was in Ethiopia last week, and the thinking there is this isn't just about development for its own sake, but also in a sense planting the seeds for greater competitiveness. You know, that the products that are produced in Ethiopia will be low carbon, therefore, you know, they may have better value in world markets. For example, if Europe imposes a border tax or some kind of a system like that. So I think, you know, it's, you know, the thinking really comes from their own kind of vulnerability, but at the same time to try and build something which allows these policymakers to imagine, you know, a better future. Because, you know, these negotiations or the discussions are not really leading to anywhere. On the question of, the low carbon technologies, we are seeing some changes in the technologies between 2008 and 2002 and today. We've seen the solar technology, you know, reduced, you know, to the level where it actually is competitive in many parts, particularly in distributed generation. So I mean, already that is happening. What's not happening fast enough is the policies that would allow you to take it, you know, one step further. I mean, you know, you have towns, you have small cities that still rely on, you know, on diesel generation. You can quite easily convert those without losing too much in terms of by still remaining, you know, in business, by being competitive. I mean, the calculations that we've done in the Gambia, in Niger, demonstrates that you know, you don't even need, you know, feed-in tariffs in some parts, because, you know, the price of electricity is so high that you could actually generate it at a reasonable level and be able to cut that price, as well as, you know, generating additional jobs and new types of, you know, innovation within your system. Is that right?
With time moving on, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. If, like me, you didn't get to ask your question, please join us all upstairs in the first floor kitchen for a glass of something. We'll pigeonhole our speaker, and you can ask him your question then. But to close the seminar, please join me in giving Yacob a round of applause. And if you don't know where the kitchen is, follow a thirsty-looking UCL person.